Meeting of the Montpelier-Roxbury Public School Board of Directors. The first item on the agenda is public comment. I do not see any public. So we'll move on to the action items under number 3.
Could I add before you get into that? I would
Thank
like
you.
to add one item to the action items, please. All of you have a copy of the minutes of March 28th, 2018, special meeting for the purpose of retreat for the Montpelier-Roxbury Board of School Directors.
We could do both minutes, I think, in one motion if someone wants to move approval of the minutes.
So I make a motion that we approve the minutes of March 28th and March 21st, 2018.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Oh, well, but wait,
It's discussion.
Oh, there was supposed to be discussion.
well, there's not usually, but.
There's not usually.
It's not a consent agenda, so,
You're right.
which is the same as the March 21st minutes, which keep saying that I was absent,
But you were there.
but I don't think I was absent. Maybe I left the room for some reason?
You left the room for a while.
Did I?
So
Okay.
we got it.
You did, you stepped out.
Okay, great.
Well recorded.
Well documented.
Okay, so there's no motions to amend. You're comfortable with the minutes? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Sorry, I will make sure we have discussion next time. The second item on the agenda is the approval of the bleacher bid. Is that for Grant or for?
Yeah, I can talk to it.
Thanks.
You all got the bid recommendation, and this is another kind of good news item. The bid was actually just for bleachers here and at the middle school and for a gym curtain at the middle school. In the hopes that maybe the bids would come in low enough, we asked for alternates for a gym curtain here as well as the middle school, and to repair or replace some backboards here at the high school. So the bids actually came in low enough to accept the alternates. So we're getting 2 sets of bleachers, 2 gym curtains, and we're getting the backboards replaced here. So all of that was within the amount, and the recommendation was to approve A+ Athletic Products as the lowest responsible bid at $151,000. And we had 152
Budget.
budgeted for this.
Were the high school curtains in the bond?
No. No, as far as inside the gymnasium itself, without the locker rooms and surrounding, the gymnasium itself, the only thing in the bond really related to the gymnasium itself was HVAC, ventilation type of activities, and the roof.
Any other questions for Grant? A motion to approve the bond?
I move we approve A+ Athletic Products bid for gymnasium work at the high school and the middle school.
I'll second.
Any discussion? All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? There's a new teacher contract. Is there a motion for approval of the teacher contract?
And that's for these, is that what
That's
Mhm.
what this
The
is.
blue. Mm-hmm.
I will move to approve the teacher contracts.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? You can pass the blue sheets into Brian either now or at the end of the meeting. Oh man, even reading D's.
I know, I'm just looking at this. Goodness
All right, we're
gracious.
moving on to the Beamers item, and I'm not even gonna read the whole thing. I'm just gonna let you take it away.
This is probably one in a long line of activities that the board is gonna have to approve, or action items the board will have to approve as a new entity. So, both Roxbury and Montpelier currently offer Beamers as the retirement. But as a new entity, Beamers requires that the board make a statement that says that they will allow administrators without teacher licenses to participate in Beamers under Group C and all other eligible employees to participate under Group B. This is basically status quo. This is what we have, it's what Roxbury has, but since it's a new entity, they need something recorded that you have made that decision.
So for anyone in the public who is following along and still awake, Beamers is the retirement system that our non-teacher employees participate in, which is the Vermont Municipal Employees Retirement System. And on the bottom of the memo from Brian, carrying over the second page, is a language for a motion. If anyone wants to do that.
I move to allow administrators without teachers' licenses to participate in Beamers under Group C and all other eligible employees to participate under Group B.
Second?
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thanks for that. All right. And then the approval of the VISBIT power of attorney and member agreement is next,
So
which
this
you
would
also
be
have in your
number
packets.
2 in that long line.
Right.
And there will be more in future meetings, but both Roxbury and Montpelier use the Vermont School Board's Insurance Trust for general liability insurance, workers' compensation, and employment. So whenever you do that, VISBIT gets a power of attorney and a member agreement that Roxbury has done as part of Washington South, and we have on file with VISBIT for Montpelier. These are the exact same documents that we already have on file with them, but unfortunately it's as Montpelier Public Schools. So they need the same documents, but as Montpelier Roxbury. And so if, I assume we're fine with VISBIT, I'm happy with them. So if we're okay with it, then you just need to approve the VISBIT power of attorney and member agreement and authorize me to sign those documents and send them back. So that we're on course to have our coverage as of July 1.
So it's a trust that basically provides our liability and workers' comp insurance.
This is
And a lot of school
Property,
districts
liability,
participate in.
Mhm.
School board
Commercial
insurance.
Mhm.
Most school districts use VISBIT. I would say probably 90% of the
Yeah,
school
I would say
districts.
something in that regard. Yep.
So I move we approve the VISBIT power of attorney and member agreement and authorize business manager Grant Geisler to sign documents.
I'll second.
Any discussion of the VISBIT motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? And the next thing is what Grant talked to the Montpelier Board about briefly earlier, the approval of the declaration of intent to reimburse bond expenses.
And Paul Giuliani, who wears many hats, in this case, he's bond counsel. He recommends that everybody who gets a bond should have an approval of declaration of intent to reimburse bond expenses. What that allows you to do is we won't get bond proceeds until probably sometime in July or maybe early August. If we are incurring a lot of expense up until that time for architectural work or anything else that might happen, if we have this declaration of intent to reimburse, then I could go back with bond proceeds in July or August, and I could reimburse our general fund or our fund balance and charge it to the bond. So I'm not sure we would do that, but I do want the flexibility to be able to do that. And I think there's language on that as well as far as the, is there for the
Yes.
motion?
To approve,
To
yep,
approve the declaration of intent.
to reimburse expenses.
Does the
bond
part
proceeds.
about Tammy Legacy need to be in the motion?
No,
That's
but
it?
we'll just, she'll
Okay.
recommendation from Mr. Giuliani.
So I move we approve the declaration of intent to reimburse bond expenses.
Second?
Any discussion of this motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and the last action item is the approval of the People's United Bank resolution.
And this is only one that we'll need. We use People's United Bank for a scholarship fund. And since we don't anticipate any activity on that account between now and July 1st, we can go ahead and transfer that from Montpelier Public Schools to Montpelier-Roxbury. And we will have another resolution kind of like this, probably right near July 1, and you may not, well, I'll probably have you approve it right before the summer break to get like our community national accounts transferred as well. But this is just one of those bank accounts. I think it's specifically for
Corey
the
Fund.
scholarship.
Yeah.
And I will need at some point to contact Jim Murphy because he'll have to sign this one eventually. And it's long and drawn out, but they are very standard documents that I've reviewed.
Has a list of people who are authorized to sign, recognized on there.
It's on the back of the front
It's on the
page.
back of this page.
Those are, I can let you know who those are the members of our Crafters Edge team.
Right, so the scholarship account is the Corey Fund, and then there's also one other account, and it's Crafters Edge that was set up separately. And so those names are teachers within the district, and that would apply just to the Crafters Edge. The first page that just has Shelley Quinn and my name on it, that's the one for the scholarship.
Okay. So different accounts, different, so
Two
it is all.
different accounts,
Those-
and the
those
Crafters
three
Edge is
teachers.
very small.
Yeah, those 3 teachers are middle school specialist teachers.
And I see
Which
now
runs
it's for
Crafter,
depositors.
which runs
only.
Crafter's Edge as a business, so therefore has a bank.
They make great furniture.
Good program.
And highs.
And
and all
pies,
sorts of
yes,
things.
pies.
Do
Yes.
you guys know about Crafters Edge?
I don't
You
know.
will.
Well,
We will. You have to-
I
You
didn't
will.
recognize the name.
It's a really good
so
program.
in the 8th grade, every year, the 8th grade has a company that's called Crafters Edge. At the end of 7th grade, the 7th graders apply for jobs in the company for the following year. They have to submit applications, they have to get references, they get interviewed. It's sort of what, how you get a job in life. And then they run the middle school dances as fundraisers. They sell baked goods, and you can order pies, you can order cookies, you can order quiches anytime from the kids who are cooking for Crafters Edge. They have a big craft sale in the fall where they sell a lot of their wood products. As Bridget said, you can get a lovely table. They have beautiful adder cutting boards. There's something for every budget
They'll
point.
make a drawer organizer to your exact specifications of your drawer and exactly how you use it. It's awesome.
Yeah, they do really good work, and they put on a dinner theater, which is coming up at the beginning of May. I think it's May 3rd and 4th. They'll be performing the Madagascar here at the high school, and the community is welcome. You can buy tickets for the dinner and the show, or just the dinner or just the show. And the kids make a great, usually Italian pasta kind of dinner, but fancy-ish, sure. It's not just a big bowl of spaghetti, it's a good dinner. And they put on a great play. Trip, and they all choose some community, give some money to Crafters Edge, and they bring some of it to the high school for their class activities.
Thank you.
More than you ever wanted to know, but it's a great. I see King Julian.
Yes.
Grant,
And if not, then I guess
Approve the resolution and give permission to the chair to sign.
Second.
all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, great.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Grant.
Thank you, Grant, thank you for keeping us on track. And also, the memo was great, Brian, thanks. Kept us all on track
Thank you,
there.
Grant.
All right,
Bridget, can I
We've
ask
got-
before we jump to
yeah,
the next section?
of course.
So some of the policies we had listed for second reading, first reading, wasn't totally accurate. Does that make a difference how we start this, if we have to get that corrected now, or if it is okay to continue with the way they presented?
I think we should probably correct the second reading piece.
Yeah, 'cause some of that's, yeah, what was
So,
it?
it's the
B,
board member conflict of
C.
interest, B, C, board member code of conduct,
Yep.
D, board superintendent relationship policies will be discussed tonight, but because we didn't reach them the last
Last
time.
time.
Oh, that's
They're
right.
not,
So they're
uh,
still in first reading
Right.
technically. Okay,
Yep.
it'd be moved up to first
Because
reading.
But shall we say that we do
warned
that, that we
didn't
moved them up to
move
first reading?
Mhm.
Or-
You
or it
can?
doesn't- We can.
I mean, it doesn't.
Because
So
functionally, that's
the reality for this is there's no minimum or maximum number of readings.
right.
So if you read a policy on a first reading and there's no substantive changes, it can be adopted at the next meeting. The critical part is that there's a 10-day warning for adoption. So we can certainly be clear about what's first, second, or third, but ultimately it's not. The most critical point for us is that we give the 10-day warning for when they are ready to be adopted.
I don't think it affects the order in which we take things.
Okay.
So just so, this is sort of outlined in the memo, but just so folks are clear. Tonight, we're gonna talk about the conflict of interest, code of conduct, and board superintendent relationship as a discussion. Those are really in a draft form and really just looking for a fairly robust discussion and input on where we're going with those. Everything else in the list under second reading are things that we have already discussed. A, we need to revisit the inter-district school policy. It has changes, we're definitely gonna revisit. And then I think E, F, G, and H, substitute teachers, fiscal management, budget execution, volunteers and work study students. We did talk about it at the last meeting. We're not adopting them tonight because they had not been on the website. And now they are, is my understanding.
They are.
So they'll be up for adoption next week. So we don't have to have substantive discussion on those, although
Well,
of
they
course we
actually
can
know.
if people want to.
Well, I apologize. They can't be up for adoption next week because that won't be within the 10-day warning. So they'll be up for adoption at the first
one
meeting in May.
Right, okay. And then you had a question too?
No, I actually have a comment.
Okay.
As I was reading through all of these policies today,
Yes.
I thought to myself, first of all, I wanted to thank you and Ryan and Steve on the policy committee for, this is a lot of work. But it occurred to me that it's an unusual place to be in, to have a whole board read all of the policies that will be in existence before they're in existence, which is July 1st, and it's an interesting thing to me. You usually get handed a big policy book, and maybe you look at a couple policies, but we will have read them all, so I thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Tina. All right. So I think we should start with the first reading ones. We'll start with those and then we might switch around the order on the second reading, we'll see. But these are the three that we are looking at for the first time with the new board. Alcohol and drug-free workplace, drug and alcohol testing of transportation employees, and prevention of employee harassment. Brian gave us all an additional document, which I
Right.
somehow already managed.
Steve, if you need
Here it is.
and the packet that's furthest up on the right
It's not the ones we got here.
is relevant to.
Right,
No, I don't think. Oh, is it?
No.
Yep, it's relevant to the drug and alcohol testing for transportation employees.
Got it.
Okay, so these I'll turn over to Brian.
Sure.
to-
So these are from the mandatory list from the VSBA website. Lori and I went through these. They are similar to the ones that are already in effect for both Montpelier and Roxbury. There are no substantive changes that we are recommending to either one of these. What I did want to point out, and that's why I gave you the extra packet, because the drug and alcohol testing is so minimal, I thought it would be helpful for the board to see what our current bus company, Student Transportation of America, does in terms of a comprehensive drug and alcohol testing program, with the caveat that we are out to bid for our next busing contract. So this, for the time being, is in effect while we are partnered and contracted with Student Transportation of America. We will have something similar with whomever else we contract with, if we end up not going with Student Transportation of America.
Do they do random drug tests?
Yes, and
They
that's
do.
covered in there. There are percentages by which they review and go by, and employees must sign off on the randomness of the drug and alcohol testing.
So I drive the senior citizen bus and they drive up in a truck and call out somebody like me to go in to be drug tested on a random basis.
I don't know if
Can
that's
I
how it works
tell
for
you?
SDA, but
It happens.
okay. The one about an alcohol and drug-free workplace is really simply about notification of it. If any individual is convicted or pleads nolo contendere, that would be a recommendation to you as a board, depending on the circumstances for dismissal. And in terms of the prevention of employee harassment, again, very much boilerplate in both what Roxbury and Montpelier Public Schools already have in effect. So no substantive changes.
So I have a question about the alcohol and drug-free.
Sure.
It's really just a clarification.
Yes.
This is a policy that governs people that work in our
Correct.
buildings. It is
Yes.
not relevant to students.
No, but each building, specifically the high school, has its own drug and alcohol requirements, and those are listed in the handbook. So yes, this is just for employees, that is correct.
I was glad to see there's someone other than the principal you could report to, lest the principal be who you are
Yes.
reporting on.
Yes, that we've had recently.
We're not taking action on these tonight,
No,
so we're not
just
waiting for
reviewing.
motions. So if anyone has questions,
Right,
I'll
if you
just
have
make
questions
sure
or
we're going
Comments
through
or anything?
questions on
Right.
the alcohol and drug-free workplace or comments on that policy.
So just to bring up a comment, with my day job, we had to undergo a legal review of our alcohol and drug-free workplace policies in light of a couple of things, including anticipated legalization of marijuana, and how that would affect potential drug testing after accidents or incidents. As it turned out, our current policy, the attorney felt was strong enough, but just to raise a flag perhaps that someone might want to take a second look at that, that has
absolutely ask that. Thank
that
you.
has a
Yep.
better eye than.
Thank you very much. I
Yeah.
appreciate you bringing that. Was not even on my radar.
Mhm. Okay.
Okay.
My only
Um,
comment.
Any comments or questions on the transportation policy? Or the prevention of employee harassment? Can't see Steve, but, okay.
I think the harassment was very thorough, so seems really good. Thank you for the detail on that.
The harassment one is fairly similar to the student harassment.
We are required to have each one, or each
Absolutely.
group, they're
Yep.
separate required
Right.
policies.
Just saying.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And procedures come with, again, much like the student one. So.
Can I,
Okay.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, on harassment, is the legal standard on this for action by the district, is that in statute? So in other words, is this under procedure, I'm not familiar with the harassment laws and how that plays out. I'm familiar with like bullying and that kind of stuff, and, there's a pretty strong standard where the district must take actions.
And that is the case. I mean, if you see under the duty of to investigate, we are required to investigate the harassment even if the complainant does not wish to proceed with a formal complaint. So it's essentially much like how all of the adults that work within proximity of students are mandated reporters.
Right.
We are mandated investigators if we learn in some way that harassment may have taken place. Even if I approach you as the potential complainant and say, it's understood from a conversation I had with Tina that this conversation was held and directed at you, you could potentially confirm it and say, but I don't wish for this to go forward. That will not deter my investigation.
And would there be a set of procedures not written here that says how you do that?
I will tell you that anytime we've had either one of these, I've been quickly in consultation with our legal team and have outlined the procedures that we will take in order to do that.
So it's done on a case-by-case basis?
It's done on a case-by-case basis.
I mean, there is some,
It says it
there is
here.
procedure in this policy.
Right.
I realize
But-
Right, but it's not as, maybe.
it's not quite as detailed
Not
as
as
the one
detailed
in
as
student
student.
policy, but
Yeah, and these categories
I
are
think
the
that's a little different.
employment categories for protection, is that, I don't know if you recognize that this is mirroring
oh, the list of
the
protected
state of
categories.
protected
I
classes.
think these are the protected
These are the
categories
protected
under the
categories.
public
Nothing in
accommodations law.
addition to it, in other words, or, okay. I mean, I'm sure it's at a minimum that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Looks good.
These will be back on a future agenda.
If there are no further concerns on these, I would propose that we warn them for adoption at the May 2nd, sounds like? At the first meeting, let's say the first meeting in May. Is that the will of this board for these three?
I'd be fine with that.
Please.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
So, on to the ones that
Yes.
are currently listed under
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You got a good set.
second reading, even though we've moved things around. Why don't we, do you wanna talk about the transfer policy, Ron?
Sure. Yeah, so it seemed like a discussion the board had 2 weeks ago regarding the in-district elementary school transfer policy was, we like the direction, we want more specifics in there, make it very clear cut in terms of what to expect. So that's what we put forward for the second draft that's in front of us tonight is, again, kind of that same theme that we're, at this point in time, not anticipating students transferring regularly between elementary schools. So we outlined what parents might expect to see if they were to ask to do so.
And the section where the line is drawn through it, you're taking out,
Correct.
is that correct?
Let me look.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Those are deletions.
Yep.
And so, and since I didn't hear the discussion last time, the question I have is, it says the Board of School Directors will consider parent requests for in-district transfers. Does anything happen before that? This does not indicate. In other words, if I'm a parent and I wish to transfer somehow to my student, does something happen before it comes to us?
Good question,
Yeah, so a lot of the other policies, and again, you missed the conversation the first time around, but a lot of the districts that we looked at, or that I looked at, drafted this policy regarding elementary school and in-district transfers, they allowed it. So their policy was much more in-depth in terms of details on how that's implemented and who does what. So those districts who would have had essentially an expected transfer of students between buildings had pretty much everything geared towards the superintendent or the administration.
Geared toward them, meaning they were making the decision.
Right, things weren't coming, the decision wasn't coming to the board in those districts who were expecting a lot of transfers. So they were different there, but no, we don't have anything in terms of, well, you know, I've personally been asked. You know, we don't have a policy on it yet, but you know, we had a conversation, but you're right, there's no procedure, there's nothing to tell us that we should send them to the principal, or we should send them to the superintendent, or write a letter to the board for what to do.
I mean, we usually take advice from the administrators.
Mm-hmm.
And if they hadn't been consulted, for example, it would be hard to get advice.
Right. So is it, so maybe just put some more specifics in here in terms of how requests should be sent, how they're handled? Would that be?
That's what I was
Might
thinking, what's the rest of
clarify
the
it.
board thinking?
Well, I mean, I think that, yeah, I think it might, just simply adding something like, that the board shall act on the, or shall, you know, act on the recommendation of the superintendent, or shall, you know, something like that. if the board wants to retain authority to make the final decision. But the other thing is that, I mean, effectively, this is a policy of permission, so it's saying we will do it. It doesn't quite say that, it says we will do it if these things are met effectively. So we've changed this around, instead of saying we're not doing it, we are doing it.
Yeah, I mean, does anyone,
I mean, I'm not sure we resolve that either way. Maybe you, Ryan, you have a memory of that, but it feels like if we're saying yes, it's okay. I mean, the big caveat, or if you want to circle one phrase in here, it's student needs. Students' needs is a very large undefined issue here, and so it still leaves us with that subjective standard that somebody's gonna have to weigh against the other stuff. So, and maybe that's the way we want it, but it's a pretty big hole.
yeah. I guess I'm concerned that we've lost the concept that it would be only in extraordinary circumstances, because
Yeah, it doesn't read that way.
it doesn't read, I think
Sure.
it does kind of read now like this is something you can ask for and,
You can make
Expect,
a request
So we need to
You can make
tighten
a
it
request.
down.
to the
Yeah.
board. 'Cause we
Does
got
anyone
that.
think, I just wanna keep pursuing the issue that Tina raised, does anyone think it should be the superintendent's decision and not the board's decision? I mean, I think anything we put in policy as a superintendent's decision could probably come to the board if the person disagreed with it.
But we're
Right,
But it would
starting-
be, it would be
To the
someone
board.
coming to us
Mhm.
saying they disagreed with the superintendent's
Well,
decision, as
yeah.
opposed to coming to us to make a decision. Honestly, I hadn't really thought about it.
Well,
but-
I was just thinking, how it read to me the first time was, I want to transfer my child, I'm going to the board.
Mhm.
That's the way it reads. We don't let
Essentially.
anything like that happen
straight to the
without a
board. Yep.
process, how you get to the board. I'm not
Yeah,
saying
you're
you
right.
shouldn't come to the board, I think you should eventually,
Yep.
perhaps, but why wouldn't somebody else have solved this problem before
Right.
that?
Well, and so I did have a similar.
We could do it
yeah.
similar to the tuition waiver thing, where right now, if somebody requests a tuition waiver for 60 days, I think Brian can approve it. But for longer than that, Brian actually brings it to the board if he is gonna recommend that it should be approved. So it might be that they make the request to the superintendent, who will then forward requests that have merit to the board for approval, or, I don't know.
Either way, that's the board making the decision though. Because shall have merit, or whatever that phrase we
Yeah.
want to use is, someone's gonna just appeal that it has merit.
Right.
So it's coming up.
I think what Brian was at least nodding his head at last time when we were discussing this was give some more structure about what standards we're using for approving. And student needs is maybe as strong as we want to be, but this is saying it's all good as long as we can demonstrate all of these things. That the capacity of the school's there, the staffing will work, the student has a need, the transportation works, and the class sizes work. As long as all that happens, it happens. I mean, that's how I would read this if I were a parent. And I think in most cases, we're gonna be able to do a few a year if we do that. And is that what we want? And then they stay in that, and then they stay in the school till they matriculate from that school, which means that then we build a new capacity around that new, being able to predict that new student body size moving forward. And then perhaps the next year there are more coming in. Now, some may matriculate out. So, but I just don't know what our objective is in terms of preserving the school in Roxbury also, as a
I mean,
community school.
Right.
Well, should that be added in some way to the consideration? If we feel strongly enough about that, if
Right.
10 people decided from Roxbury they wanted to go to Union, there's a real problem.
Well, Bridget had
That would be the-
just alluded to this, well, last time we talked about this idea of the extraordinary student need somehow.
Mm-hmm.
That we were gonna make the decision based on student need, we're gonna make everything up, we're gonna part the waters for a student who has who has the need. We're not gonna let anything stand in the way if there's an extraordinary student need, but that's a pretty high bar. And if we could figure that out, because we are one district, we're gonna take care of students the very best we can, no problem with a transfer if it really is an extraordinary need of some sort, and we don't, and how do you define that short of, how do you define that?
Well, we as a system might recommend transfer for extraordinary needs. Special ed might recommend it for something.
This
Right.
policy
That
would
is
be-
not about that.
Right.
Oh, what?
Oh,
You could
special
offer-
ed, no.
It's not-
Special
It's
ed,
not
would-
about that.
special ed, that decision would be made in the IEP
IEP
team,
team.
and that would be something that this board would
Right.
honor, I'm confident.
Yeah.
And I agree with Steve with all the points that he is making. I think I would be cautious and would suggest perhaps that the board think about, at least in the beginning, a higher standard, simply because there is a commitment to preserving the community at the Roxbury Village School, and I think I'll say this, and I'm sure this will resonate with Tina as well as anybody else who's been in the classroom. I think it's always easier to start off a little stronger than you need to be and back it off a little bit. If you find out that you're having too many requests that you can't honor, as opposed to having it be a little looser and then try to, like to Steve's point, we have 10. Now we have to make this stronger because we are struggling with the capacity issue. That's just something for the board to consider, because I know of this board's commitment to the viability of the Roxbury Village School as part of this merger.
I have a suggestion.
Yes.
If between the first sentence and the second sentence, if we said something like, in some extraordinary instances, the superintendent may recommend that it is in a student's best interest to be served in a different school, then the Board of School Directors will consider that recommendation and decisions will consider but are not limited to, etc.
That's good.
So it stays with the students and doesn't come back to families, so that's good.
Did we already resolve that one? We didn't want it to be extraordinary family or student situation?
I just said there may be extraordinary cases in which the superintendent may recommend that it's in the best interest of a child, or may find that it's in the best interest of the child too.
You want to use that standard?
That wasn't what you said the first time, I'm pretty sure. You said, maybe I'm wrong, I thought you said the superintendent may recommend that a student would be best served in a different school, or?
I definitely didn't say that. I said
No.
the student's needs would be, or it's in the student's best interest. I think I said student.
I probably stopped writing too fast. The
Well,
superintendent
the
may.
word extraordinary
But
and best interest to me are two different things.
Yeah, I'm saying it's extraordinary because it's very unusual. It would be a very unusual circumstance for the superintendent to find that a child has to be served in one or, in a specific elementary school. We want to convey that that's extraordinary, non-ordinary.
As a board, we're saying, we would do this transfer only in extraordinary circumstances.
If the superintendent recommended it to us on the basis of it being in the best interest of the student. And we're not going to try to preview what all those circumstances might be.
It's better to leave it
Mhm.
simple.
It'd be like, it's like, if there are extraordinary circumstances, then potentially a child's best interest would be met at this other school. But you can't have the best interest separate from extraordinary circumstances.
Right.
Okay.
Is that approach generally working for folks?
So then we'll bring back a draft that has things going to the superintendent first, highlighting extraordinary circumstances, staying focused on students, not families.
I think from the decisions point on, that's all good, personally.
So would we like to keep it? So right now, if someone were to be granted a transfer for whatever the circumstance was, would we like to keep it that they stay in that school until they move on to middle school, or do we think it makes sense to have them just for the remainder of that academic year?
No, I think if you,
I think we want them to stay put so that we
Yeah, you
can
don't wanna
plan
move
for
them back
class
and forth,
size
back
and
and
so
forth.
That's why we stuck it that way this time, but,
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes sense. I mean, I liked the idea that there might be extenuating circumstances. Because the extraordinary circumstance could be a short-term thing.
It could
like,
change.
so
Right.
Right.
we might have room
Yep.
for that, but not in the normal. Yeah. Any other input on this?
So we'll have another draft of this at the next meeting, and I'll label this as a third reading. People okay with that? Okay.
Yes. So you also have in front of you these draft policies that are part of kind of the core governance policies for the board, and that's the board superintendent relationship, the board member conflict of interest, and the board member code of conduct. I'll talk briefly about the board superintendent relationship, and then Ryan is really more responsible for the conflict of interest and code of conduct. First of all, disregard the numbering. I just tend to numbering things one when I draft things because we don't have a packet of policies together yet for governance policies. But so the board superintendent relationship is a stab at redrafting that provision that we have in the MPS policies, which is called that, and sets up the division of labor between the board and what's delegated to the superintendent. So it's a stab at redrafting it in a way that is shorter, is not phrased in the negative, the way the classic policy governance policies are drafted. And otherwise tries to, tries to, just expand a little bit on the evaluation piece. So I'll start at the beginning. In terms of what's similar and what's different. The board would direct the district's operations only through the superintendent. That's pretty similar to the classic policy governance model. Just pulling it up. The board acting only as an entity is certainly, we talked about that at the retreat. That's a very similar concept. The board supervises the superintendent and not district staff. Again, that is also, basically the way the policy governance model works, that you're working through the superintendent. The board role in hiring, dismissal, and discipline, that's just an effort to simplify what's in the current policy. Then there's the section on, because the board's most important role is to create policy. That part is really still a work in progress for sure, because we haven't really talked about how we're gonna structure the policies in this district,
Well, I was
in the
gonna
new
say
district. So we have some question
when I
marks
read
there.
that one, I thought, well, we can't really do that one until we decide what our model of governance is.
Well, I think we made a lot of progress towards that at the retreat, right?
We
So,
did, but,
at
things
some
like
point you have to
M's
start
policies. Right.
figuring,
No, I
it all sort of fits together. It's kind of a jigsaw puzzle, the pieces all fit together. But right, we need to make more progress on what kinds of policies we envision having. And I would flag under 1.4, this discretion piece. This, again, it's phrased differently. It's because it's not using that negative phrasing from the policy governance model, but it's the same concept that the superintendent gets to interpret the policies and adopt any reasonable interpretation of the policies, and that's part of the delegation of authority. And that language there under 1.4 near the end, the board must respect and support decisions made by the superintendent that reflect a reasonable interpretation of an existing ends or operational policy, even if the board or its members may have made a different decision. That's basically saying if it's a reasonable way to interpret the policy, it goes.
Do we define reasonable anywhere?
That is not defined in the current policy. It's a very good question.
What was the question?
Yeah.
Is the word reasonable defined anywhere?
Yeah.
I got confused the first time I read that one, and I wonder if I don't have it right now, but if we want to think of different wording for the very last bit of that section, because it says, even if the board or its members may have made a different decision, which the first time I read it, I read, the board has to respect the superintendent's decision, even if the board made a different decision. but that's not what it's saying. It's saying even if the board, in the shoes of the superintendent, might have come to a different conclusion, it's not.
That's exactly what it means. And
Right, and so I
yeah,
think we
and
need a
it's
different
opinion almost.
phrasing there, because we don't wanna say the superintendent can make a decision even if we already made a decision.
which is not right.
Right.
Or that we've declared some
Yeah.
decision and the superintendent can make an entirely different decision.
Right.
It's easy to
That's-
get stuck on this one, because the language can make it seem almost an unimpeachable decision, and I don't think we want that standard either. Or maybe we do, maybe we must have that standard, but my sense is that what we want is the superintendent to act without a bunch of second guessing and negating of authority, but where is the standard at which point we say it's the unreasonable, is that the standard, when it's no longer reasonable?
That
sounds right.
That is, I mean, but it's up for discussion, right? Like
Right.
that,
But is
so
that-
this is starting from the policy governance model, and yeah, that would be the policy governance
That was an
standard.
unreasonable decision.
Yeah, and in fact, what, you know, an interesting point that you take from the policy governance model is that they say you have to really, it really is any reasonable interpretation. If you're thinking in the back of your mind, we're just giving them discretion because they're gonna do the right thing, you're not doing it right. Because that's, like, you're thinking that there's some standard that you would apply to what would be reasonable that you're not putting in the policy. So it isn't about they get discretion because we trust them to do it right. It's, we've set the policy, we've said as much as we feel like we need to say, and anything that falls under that policy that's a reasonable version of it is okay, because we've given them discretion to do that.
But if somehow they didn't follow the policy, then you would be
That's a different
disagreeing.
story.
That's a different story.
How about,
And by reasonable, the carvers might mean like not illegal,
Right,
not
sure.
evidencing mental illness, not causing
Conflicts
actual
of
harm,
interest and, yeah.
but anything above that bar is,
so a
Yeah.
good example of how this plays out in reality is where Brian comes to us and says, hey, I'm about to make a decision on something, I just need a little guidance first. Right? And he goes off and makes a decision. We're really happy he came to us and asked us about that first, and he probably is too, because now he's got his discretion, but he's also got, like, he kinda knows where not to go practically. But he doesn't have to do that, and, but sometimes if he doesn't do that, he feels he gets burned, and Brian is just a placeholder at this point, because I'm not picking on him, I'm saying a superintendent might feel this way. So he does it because he's smart, and he's thinking about not stirring up a hornet's nest unnecessarily, but we're saying, you don't do that, you don't need to do that, basically. Or if you do that, and we give you a guidance, and you ignore it, and it was still reasonable, board doesn't get to come back and say, we just had a discussion about this. Because we had a discussion, but he can ignore it. And we can't then spend the next meeting saying, why did you ignore us? And so I'm just wondering, like, are we
Yeah.
good with this? Is this really where we wanna be?
This is the time to have that conversation.
Yeah.
This is the time to have that conversation. You know, that doesn't have to be in the policy at all.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be framed that way.
It is good to define the idea that when we delegate authority under a policy, we've truly delegated it. We've truly let go of it. And I think reasonable standard is that's the idea of that, is we've truly let go of it. And we haven't held it just tight enough to be able to bite him or her.
I would agree. However you choose to go with this, I would simply suggest that you're clear what is truly the superintendent's work
Yeah.
and what is truly the board's work. And,
I
and
agree.
however, again, strictly or for lack of a better word at 8:30, loosely you want to define that, it should, because you do, to Steve's point, you want the individual to have the freedom to say, this is the policy the board gave me, this is the work that I can do within the policy, I'm gonna go and do this work. Or conversely, this is not, I do have to check in, or whatever the actual parameter the board is comfortable with extending, be clear where that line is.
Or where we say, could you please check in before you make that decision? You could be like, no, thanks. Right? And that might be fine, and we need to stop asking, in effect. So,
But likewise, I'd say, the superintendent shouldn't come and ask us our opinion if the superintendent doesn't intend to listen to that opinion.
under this policy, he
I
can.
know, but I'm just saying, as a matter of practice, you
Yeah.
wouldn't wanna have a discussion with the board who said, we think you ought to do this, and then you go off and do that. why ask?
Well,
Just do it.
You could say, as a purely advisory discussion, I'm asking you all for your opinions, I would need some guidance on this, but I retain the right to make this decision, and I wanna make that clear at the beginning, that I'm gonna make this decision, and I may disagree with what you advise me, but I would still like to hear your advice. You're my counsel.
Well, if you're that
I mean, that's like
clear.
an odd thing for a superintendent.
It is, I mean, I might do that, I might say, look, I get to make the final call here, but it doesn't mean I don't want some opinions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know,
Yes.
seems politically dangerous.
Yes.
Yeah.
It
Yeah,
does.
like a killer to me. Just do it.
So, I mean, that's the place we put someone in when we say this, the only standard is that it be reasonable, unless we wanna say, and in consultation with the board, or after having heard the counsel of the board, or, you know, and then all of a sudden you're starting to erode that autonomy and authority. There's-
Do we have, model policies for these, or other districts' policies, or,
The model policy for this kind of thing
yeah,
is the Carver model, which is
Oh,
what we
really?
have in the MPS.
okay.
With
I
all
mean,
the
that's-
negatives.
With all the negatives, that's the model
That
for
VSBA
this.
provides?
No, the VSBA doesn't do this in the same way at all. It's,
Okay.
it's very, very different.
Well, we might.
And we don't have to go, so we don't
Right.
have to go this route. Or we could,
But we could look at what they have for how to draw that line, if they,
it's really not,
it's really different.
it's really different. I mean, it's really not, they don't have a policy that I think puts
That outlines
the
the,
categories in quite the same way.
Cause they're big into that delineation, you would think they would have a description of how you make it.
I wonder what the intent is there.
don't
I
think
would
have
read what they
VSBA
have,
or something.
the intent being that it's more policy by policy, maybe.
You looked at what their model was?
Well, they don't have this I mean, this is not how they structure the policies. The concept that the Carver model has of here's the board superintendent relationship, here are the limitations,
don't
and
have
here's
to
the
say it.
governance, that, the VSBA doesn't set
Right,
that
I
up.
got
it.
It's just a totally different framework.
Can I,
Oh, go ahead.
I looked up, Orange Southwest is a neighbor of ours, and they're pretty close to policy governance. The way that they've structured it, at least according to what I could see quickly, as long as the superintendent uses any reasonable interpretation of the board's ends and executive limitation policies, superintendent is authorized to establish all further procedures, make all decisions, essentially they're as strict as it can go. So if you don't have to necessarily go that far, so you could take this, and I could send this to you and Ryan if you're interested. You could go, I mean, instead of, I'm trying to think of how you could help here, instead of just any reasonable, I don't know, somebody could help me wordsmith
Well,
this.
maybe it's really the reasonable interpretation of what? So it's the policy and the board's current temperament, I mean, is really what it is. It's both those things. So you're taking a policy, and then you're kind of taking a temperature reading of the board and saying, I made a reasonable determination based on that. The question is, how do we codify a temperature-taking process?
Right.
And I don't know that you can do that. If we really hone in on the operational policies as part of this, we're talking about, I mean, all of that work has to be done under operational policies
They're not very
in
clear.
terms of how much structure do we give? And I think Bridget said it really well, is that you kind of have your piece, you have your say when you build your policies.
I agree.
So you build your policies as thoroughly as you want to guide the superintendent, and then you stop. And if you feel like, boy, the superintendent really blew it on that one, it's like, well, let's write a new policy next time but until then, we don't get to change it. And so if we were to look at our operational policies as our hard work in this and leave the reasonable standards so that there's at least at the end, there's a line that everyone can follow, which is, look, you delegated it to me, that's it. I did something reasonable under what you delegated, and you were mute, you didn't say anything about that. So, I mean, think about this as budget creation time.
That's kind of how
It's like, it's chaos, right? If you don't, and how do you create policies, operational policies that guide you don't create budget.
But that's, I mean, you've been working on that, Steve, that we're hoping to bring before the board a budget policy, that it's not like any policy the MPS board had before.
Right.
Right.
That would put more specifics into the expectation and the process
So that's more
So
of
that
that
the board
temperature
would be
reading.
creating it,
Right.
creating those expectations through a policy that says, this is what we expect
But
to
do
see.
we only do that during budget building, and do we not do that during other types of building?
I think I think that's entirely up to the board, right?
Because it's a very
Figure that
specific
out.
operational basically the
Yeah.
budget policy is an operational policy. I guess we could do that for adopting new policies, we could have a operational policy on that, and that walks us through more carefully. Or any other policy, we could add as much detail as we want, and I think what we identified early on was that we at least have to do that for the budget policy, because that one has been a train wreck.
And I
So-
think to your point, I think you would then be able to quote unquote limit or expand your definition of
Right.
reasonability based on the policy that you write. You know, so that could almost be the temperature taker there. I mean, you could craft a budget policy that says the superintendent shall not bring a budget that exceeds you could draw the line in the
Right.
sand right there.
Or shall consult with
Or
the board.
right, or how to actually do it.
Yeah.
And then the reasonability is, well, it says you shall consult. You did not consult.
Mhm.
So that becomes less black and white based on how you craft it.
I'm getting comfortable with the standard of reasonable, knowing that it leaves a lot of work in the operational policy creation sphere for us.
And what VSBA's board superintendent relationship policy says, it says a bunch of stuff like, we'll be nice to the superintendent and his office staff, which is a good idea. But to this point, it says that the board directs the superintendent through written policies that prescribe the results the board wants to achieve.
The results, not the process.
Prescribed results.
But still, I'm saying the same thing, Steve, that it's all about what we set out in the policies.
completely agree.
The extent of the policy is what creates, like, the more detailed the policy is, the more constrained the superintendent is. The more broad the policy is, the more we're delegating decision-making.
Or you
to
could
the
even just say the way that I could even see you continuing to use the word is you're limiting the scope of reasonability. So
Right.
there's either more interpretation
Right.
or less.
The more we put in, the tighter we make the fence, or the bigger we make the
That's
fence,
exactly
is
right.
all about what we put in the policies. Unless we wanna have, if you say anything other than this reasonableness thing, then you're creating something outside of,
Yeah, I'm
Same
fine
number
with
of
reasonable
policies.
now,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel better about it now.
if you didn't say that, you would almost be creating a weird, like, gotcha category where you're like,
Which is not.
the superintendent has to carry out all the policies, except we can at any time say that that's not what we want.
That's it,
Right.
Yeah,
that's it.
yeah.
Right.
That's it, it's the universal clawback.
Yeah, right. So I don't think we want that.
In the current MPS policy, also in this board superintendent relationship policy, which is here in 1.5, is the monitoring piece, which we did not really get to at the retreat in terms of talking about whether that's something we see as part of the.
In the parens at the bottom, where you've got a question, I'd substitute all mandated policies. You've got everything else handled, but
Right, but you would say that there should be monitoring on all the policies, which is
well,
not,
you've got ends, compliance with ends, operational, and all mandated policies. In other words, all mandated policies plus the other.
Actually, those are ones that must be
Everything. I don't know what.
monitored.
it's an interesting point, because
Mhm.
that's not, under the MPS board, the things that we think of as the mandated policies weren't really in the work plan for
No.
monitoring,
Right.
No,
because
we were only monitoring the ends and limitations.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
But I would think the mandated,
because the
Maybe it
ends
was
took
just
care of
assumed
the
you were.
goals,
Right.
and the limitations were just like, compliance with
Yeah.
Some of them touched on
details.
our
Right,
mandated
there was
policies.
certainly
because we
overlap
did-
Yeah.
in the
Don't
limitations.
break the
with
law,
mandated.
then
Right.
you're following those policies.
And you wouldn't be able to do all of them at once. I think it would be a good idea to set up a schedule.
So the thought that I had, which I put in here for discussion, was if folks want some plan of monitoring to continue as part of the way the board works, that instead of putting the monitoring schedule in a policy, we should commit to that being part of the work plan that we adopt every year.
There
You
you
know,
go,
that there's-
flexibility.
We have an annual schedule, there's a point at which we're supposed to start the annual schedule, which in theory could be May, you know, for the next year, and you start it. And at that point, we would say, like, this is the ends policy we're gonna do this year. Or we're gonna do all the ends this year, you know, we're only gonna do one, or we're gonna, you know, whatever it is, we're gonna do it, and that's what we're gonna do this year.
The previous calendar included all the ends and all the limitations.
Yeah, and my sense is that we couldn't do all that.
We
Was that-
couldn't do.
Like, it was really
Well,
hard to do it all.
The big problem with the ends was that before we did an ends report, we were trying to define the ends indicators, and that was what took a huge amount of time, because we didn't have indicators.
Chicken
For
and
the
egg.
superintendent to bring
Mhm.
back.
Yeah. The limitations were pretty straightforward. The mandated policy thing is just a little weird because, you know, so Brian has to report on, are we in compliance with the alcohol and drug-free workplace? Does it tell us to do anything? You know, or like are we in compliance with the transportation policy? What would
It says that-
that report look like?
It says that the board must systematically monitor the superintendent's compliance with. That doesn't necessarily say to me that he has to give a report on every single one of them all the time. But it allows you to do some monitoring on any of them if something would come up.
I mean, some of the things that occur to me, and I don't know how we would operationalize this, but one is, are they being updated?
Yes.
Like, that's something.
Right.
Are things like having the right person to be the reporting, like, you know, we've updated who the report person is based on turnover. You know, some of the other things like that change in the
Yeah.
policies, like, is some,
That's what I
do
mean.
we know we're keeping them up to date, and how
That's a
is
good
that,
point.
that's primarily the superintendent's job, how would the board sort of
Well,
put in place its
the
role of making sure
VSBA
that's happening?
Yeah, the VSBA gives us at the end of each legislative session, they tell us all the changes that will affect our policies, and we should put it on our calendar to review that and then schedule updates.
Policy work.
That should come out in, you know, July or August, probably every year.
So all that likewise, I don't think needs to be in the policy, it's just part of our procedure of how we would do that. And I like what you wrote about on this.
Okay. And then there's also, this is a very much a rough stab. Tina also looked at this, something about the evaluation process, which is very bare bones in the current NPS policy. This language is really a departure from the Carver model, because, you know, in the Carver model, the superintendent's performance is the performance of the district. So, there you go away and evaluate that. This was an effort to come up with something more, to put some, you know, details and framework around an evaluation.
I think the effort here was, I love this, I think that the effort here is just, you look at the performance of the district, but you also look at the process of managing the district, sort of the work of the managing process, which is separate from the performance outcome. And they both have to be very good. You have to have a high level of both, and so I think that this kind of points to that idea, and you've actually just created a detailed laundry list almost here.
Right, it's
But I think-
basically a laundry list.
Which is certainly more clear than the category of shall be evaluated on management process, which is kind of, to me, too vague to be meaningful.
And it's in a positive manner in preference to all those
Yeah.
negative
Mhm.
things that I
Yeah.
never thought told us anything.
I think it looks pretty good. The first sentence is the one that comes out of Carver, and it's, is it clear to folks what that means? Because it's this, in the Carver model, it's a big sentence.
Right.
It's like, it's like a mathematical equation, which is the two are equal and there is no other factors, variables in it. And this adds new variables.
Do we want, actually I hadn't thought about this, but before the retreat, reviewing some of the Carver stuff, you know, Carver would really emphasize that boards' evaluations of themselves is really important also.
It is.
We don't
That's a
have,
different policy, I think.
It
Yeah,
is,
it's
that's
a
in,
different
We do
that's
have
what's
that.
now in like 4
4.4.
of
Okay.
the board, but
Just
that
functional.
whole section 4 is the board's governance process.
the governance, so that's where
Yeah.
that would fall into.
Yeah,
Okay.
and we should do that, I agree,
Mhm.
we should definitely do that.
We
Yes.
have done, but
Yeah.
not recently.
Yeah, so those ones weren't fresh in my mind, so just,
Yep.
it's out there.
Alright.
Virginia, could I ask
Yep.
kind of a semantics question? 1.1, the opening sentence, only decisions of the full board acting as an entity are binding on the superintendent. Do we need to include full?
Yes.
Should it,
Actually, we do.
Yes.
does that make sense, or would it just be the
Mhm.
board?
Because,
Entity.
are you concerned that full suggests it has to be everyone?
All 9 members,
As opposed to a
yes,
decision of the board?
based
Oh,
on the
see,
quorum.
that's not unanimous.
Well, the board acting as an
Doesn't-
entity is
As
full.
an entity.
Right, so
Yeah,
maybe
I
we
agree.
could take full out,
So that'll-
full out.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was an issue or if it might be a concern, but
It makes
did
it
catch
seem
my-
like it has to be unanimous.
yeah, it did
Yeah.
catch my
It
attention
does
whenever I
imply
read it
that,
the first
doesn't it?
time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and because if you take, even if you take out full, the next sentence makes it clear
Right.
Right.
what you're
Yeah,
talking about.
you
It's
could
not-
take out full only decisions of the board acting as an entity.
Right. This, by the way, that second paragraph is a,
It's new, isn't
it
it?
is new. I think
Mhm.
there were pieces of it in the Carver policy, pieces of it in the VSBA policy, and I may have even found them somewhere else, but the idea is to, actually, the VSBA policy has options on this issue. It's a really, this is an interesting question of how much you want to allow board members to interact with
the
staff, the superintendent and with staff members. There's actually one version of the VSBA policy that says something like, you know, the board staff relationships or board staff communication is encouraged, but the board doesn't tell them what to do.
Right.
And that's kind of confusing
It
because
gets
it's like,
really dicey.
like, you're out there talking to them about what they do, but not telling, I mean, that's dicey. So we had some discussion about that on the policy committee, and so this was a proposal to basically, you know, try to funnel requests for information through the superintendent. But that's a question. I mean, you could say that board members could ask for things from staff members too. And I think actually, it didn't make its way into the policy, but Steve and Ryan and I had talked about whether we might wanna say something like, if a board member is directing a request to the superintendent, they have to copy the board chair, so that it's kind of like a check, like the
Right.
board chair like knows what's going on. You're
That's
not
a good
asking them
idea.
for permission, but,
Yeah.
Do y'all feel like this is a reasonable approach here? The idea here is that you're not prohibited from asking for something, but the superintendent needs to feel very comfortable saying,
Mm-hmm.
I give you that, but that's gonna take more time than you imagine, and I'm not gonna be able to produce that, at least not in any reasonable amount of time. And so, if you really want that, ask the rest of the board to make the motion.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
it's
I think
very
it's-
clear. It says you can ask, but be
Say no.
prepared that he's gonna
Yeah,
say no
I think it's
sometimes.
clear.
and it gives the superintendent a little
And
guidance
he's not
to feel
required
comfortable
to say
saying no
yes.
or yes,
Yeah.
depending on the standard.
It says it's okay to ask, but he doesn't have to
right,
deliver.
The word, the standard is significant, right?
yeah.
Which is fine. Just me, that's basically
Like
anything, by the way.
Yeah, it's very hard
If
to
it
get
takes
away
any
from
effort
things
at
like
all,
that.
you just say no. It's a little
Not
more
today.
sheep. You say no, whatever.
However, it does indicate that then the full board could be asked, and if the full
Yeah.
board says yes, then the superintendent has to do it.
What I like is that the chair is not the second step here,
Right.
because it doesn't put the chair in the place of acting on behalf of the board,
It
Right.
goes back
Or
to the full
unilaterally.
board.
which is what we talked about at the
Mhm.
retreat.
Yeah.
The rest is good.
Keeping an eye on the time. So,
So that'll come back to us.
oh, it's definitely gonna come back. I
Mhm.
mean, my vision on this, if others agree, is that we're gonna have to have like a packet of them before we act on any of them.
Yeah,
But like, it's just really important that we
We
kind
need
of
to get-
understand that
Yeah,
this
this
is
is a
going in the
good-
right direction.
Yeah, we have
and
to be thorough.
try to
with
keep
that.
coming
Well,
back with
and
more.
as I think we've seen already, one sort of affects the next.
Exactly,
So you
they're
have to
really
know what we're
interrelated.
thinking, they'll get easier as you go on, I
Right.
think.
Yeah. So the conflict of interest and code of conduct are pretty related. I don't know if you want to talk about them together, Brian, or
Sure, no, we could. I mean, I could give
go through them.
a little bit of the background, but
Yeah.
as we're
that'd be
talking
good.
about these, do keep this in mind. So the board member's conflict of interest is a mandatory policy, required policy set forth by VSBA. Both of our districts have had that essentially adopted kind of status quo in the past. And then the board member of conduct, Roxbury had some code of conduct stuff set off by itself. The Montpelier policies had a lot of the content in the code of conduct was included in most of the BSR, the board superintendent relationship policies in the Montpelier district. So it's not new.
It's also in 4.5,
Yeah.
the governance policies.
Yep, so it's
Yeah.
not new, but it is kind of all combined by itself, a new policy. And we did want to have a general discussion whether or not we felt that it made sense to keep these two things as separate policies or potentially combine them into one. But, so again, your conflict of interest policy, pretty straightforward, nothing too crazy there. The code of conduct policy kind of came to fruition. One of our first policy committee meetings, that kind of came up, does this board need bylaws? Montpelier had a city charter, there was this, there was that, does it make sense? Do we need to essentially kind of reaffirm some of the things that were decided upon in the Articles of Agreement when we merged? And so I reached out to VSBA to get some guidance there, and they're like, no, the Articles of Agreement are good to go as they are. You have your board terms, you have the number of people, how the votes, et cetera, all taken care of. You can consider the Articles of Agreement your bylaws for the board. But you should really have how the board is going to operate. You really need a code of conduct. So a lot of the stuff, again, has been combined from the existing Roxbury and Montpelier information, but then a lot of the stuff also came from VSBA in terms of their best practices. So like what we included as the appendix, the Declaration of Commitment, that is literally verbatim from VSBA's essential workbook. And that literally came out of their page. So this is straight from VSBA. Again, there's a lot. It feels like it's kind of nitpicky, but we figured, again, general discussion tonight, kind of get some guidance on how detailed we want to get with this. If it's too over the top, if it's good, it gives us a structure, et cetera. So this is what we have to present and discuss. Peter?
Well, first, as always, thank you for all the work. So anything I say, thought would be critical in the hope of making this better. So in the number 2 there at the top, we agree to avoid words and actions that create a negative impression on an individual, the board, or the district. So I'm fine with the part about the individual, but it seems a little constricting. Like, for example, am I not supposed to say at this meeting that I'm very disappointed, as an example, that the playground is very behind schedule and parents are upset and I'm upset too? I mean, that would be creating a negative impression
Of the district.
on the board or district.
I think that's just saying that a project is behind schedule. You're not saying like this board is mismanaging the project.
Okay. Well,
That
not
might
that
seem,
this
that
is
might
happening.
seem like a
Somebody
blind
is-
Right.
But
distinction.
okay, so let me just say for the cameras and everyone else, this is a hypothetical. Let me pick
Right.
something else.
Yeah.
I am very disappointed that the board's management of the project to redo the baseball field is well behind, and I think we're dropping the ball. Like, to me, that is not necessarily, that's critical and meant to inspire us to take action. But I am creating a negative impression of the board and the district on purpose because I believe we need to do better. So I mean,
I think this is more about like going, talking to your friends at the basketball game and being like, I just feel like the board is terrible,
okay,
but
so, but you could see how it,
yeah,
It
You
does
could
say in
read-
all situations the board will.
it does.
There's a little, to me, that this infringes in a few areas on sort of the speech rights
Yeah,
of an elected
exactly.
official, and I think
To be honest.
I think we need to comb through it with that a little
Right.
bit. I think most of this is fine and
Yeah.
good, but the areas where it feels the most nitpicky are the areas where it's asking us to all be a team, all be
Sure.
like of one voice, and I think we have to be careful about that when we're elected. I mean, we talked about this at the retreat a little bit, and it's, I think most of this is probably just fine, but there's a few of those spots that I think we
So
have to
the-
be careful.
The current NPS policy says that individual members will make every reasonable effort to protect the integrity and promote the positive image of the district and one another, and never embarrass each other or the district. Just so you know, we're already governing on the other
Lowered the
board.
bar.
But that doesn't mean, but that
Followed
policy
or
was
not, that was.
appropriate. I mean, I don't know.
It doesn't mean we need to, I just think
Yeah.
people should know that we already.
Okay,
Well,
Um,
I think the next sentence, it says, while we encourage debate and differing points of view, we will do it with care and respect. So
That's fine.
if
That's
Peter's
fine.
going to say something about the baseball field, that's fine. He's just not gonna yell at me at a board meeting
No, and
and
I'm-
call me names.
and that I agree
actually
with.
don't object to a board member saying what you just said.
and that, but,
Yeah.
but
I don't,
I
that
worry,
doesn't bother me.
Right.
I worry about being told that I shouldn't be creating a negative impression
Yeah.
of the board or
To use
district.
as a weapon.
Right.
Yeah.
And you could, someone who is, let's just say
Mhm.
hypothetically, I was the only conservative member of this board and everyone else is super out there. You all could use that against me because I'm creating a negative impression of the board because I don't believe you all should be spending all this money
Sure.
on doing something. And like, I just worry that, I mean, it's probably not gonna happen, but we are like
No, it's
proving
important.
this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I get to bring up my two other things and we can move on, or we can, I can keep beating this dead horse.
Discuss.
So, that's all I have to say on that one, and we could wordsmith it, or, I don't know. do whatever.
Did you have other points you wanted to?
Well, down the list, I don't know, I don't wanna skip past anyone else, name other things before.
Anyone else wanna weigh in on the first couple? Do others, I heard Steve saying he shares that concern, do others
Not,
share the
yeah,
concern?
actually, I didn't even pick up on that one, but I think that's true. I was more down in section B, and then also
I have
later
section
on
B,
also.
and I have section B comments too.
Actually, I'm thinking if even you eliminated that whole sentence that you don't like and just said, while we encourage debate and differing points of view, we will do it with care and respect.
I mean, I like what Michelle said, though. What Michelle said is what we should be doing. We should not be disparaging the district and the board.
Right.
We should not be doing that, saying,
Right.
oh, this board is terrible, we're such a bunch of losers. Like, that's not content
Or,
based.
or
Right.
like add it, similarly, I'm just gonna keep using this. You know, talking with other parents and like, oh yeah, the district has a real problem with, you know, making, as parents,
Right.
we are inclined to speak irresponsibly in social situations, but when we're on the board, we have to remember that
Right.
actually we kind of represent the district and we should speak supportively and not irresponsibly.
I could not agree more.
But I don't
That
know how
is-
you express that in a way that,
Okay.
So what if we came up with language that was less mandatory and more aspirational?
Mhm.
yeah,
You know,
that's.
that was more about,
Just
we
keeping
board
it-
members aspire to, or should
Be positive role models.
Yes,
be
and
Strive
Yeah.
to
strive to
represent
Strive
the
to.
district and.
so that we know what we're trying to do, but we're not necessarily ordering
Nobody
people
can hammer you
to do
with
things.
So,
Sure.
but like as a smaller example, again, and I, just to put a little finer point, because Michelle's right, like, I'm sitting next to Brian, we're co-parenting, we're speaking out board things, like, that is inappropriate. I think we all get that, but like, for example, let's say, the example again, that you all have gotten super, super liberal and I've gotten conservative, and I went to a meeting of parents who share my politics and are very conservative, and I would go, this board is out of line with Montpelier, and I want us to spend less money, and I think the board is way out of line with voters. Like, that's very negative, but
Mhm.
that is to me a reason, like Steve was saying, that's kind of a free speech. Like, I wanna get people to run for office and change the composition and do all that stuff, like, that should not be seen, that's not out of bounds to me. Maybe this is one of those Felix Frankfurter pornography things, like, pornography when you see it.
Yeah,
But maybe we can try to put words into it, because there has to be a free speech element where we're trying to be constructive and do what I think is right for the board without disparaging its members, that kind of
And
thing.
the board itself.
So no ad hominem.
So,
Go to the next one, okay. So in section B, to be efficient and effective, long board meetings must be avoided. I mean,
yeah,
Michelle slipped that one in.
I mean, no one likes long meetings, but
Some people less than others.
so I think what this is getting at, this is, we did not make this up, this is a VSBA
Right.
joke, I'm pretty sure.
No, actually,
It came from somewhere.
I think some of this came from Montpelier's. A
Not
lot of
that
Don't
one.
doubt it.
I'm not
There's no way it's that one.
We've never
But
found
I-
that. But I think what this is
Section
getting at,
B one
It's a
looks
nice
very familiar,
goal.
so.
Yeah.
but-
I think what this is getting at is you should be keeping that in mind as a board member. Like, it's not
Yeah.
that, sometimes the board might have so much work to do
Right, I agree.
that the meeting
Right.
is 4 hours, but
Yes.
as you're
In the ideal.
participating
That's
in the
fair
board
enough. Right.
meeting,
Totally.
you shouldn't just be yammering
And
on
I know
and
that's
on
what
and
this
on.
means, but when you read this
Right, it
wording,
does.
Yeah.
someone could say, well, there's 74 people in the audience, we're not gonna hear them because right there, we
Yeah.
signed the code of conduct, long meetings avoided, y'all
Not
go
gonna
home.
happen.
Yeah.
And that's all I'm saying, like, we're not gonna do like a filibuster thing here.
Yeah.
And we're not gonna have like,
Yeah.
but there has to be more clarity that the reason to avoid a long meeting is one person going on and on and on and on, right? And
I think Bridget's point to help move this conversation along is that this could be written in sort of an aspirational, you know,
Yeah.
I think
thank you.
Bridget's,
We wanna respect board members' time and use the time
Right.
effectively
Right.
and try to
Effective.
handle
instead of, you know,
questions,
yeah, I mean,
individual
even,
questions
We're not
outside of the
talking to
meeting.
ourselves.
even with this, section B1, instead of the word will, aspire to, or will try, you know, I mean, I think, I agree that it's hard, you know, I look at the one that says to not interrupt each other. We try,
Well,
I
but-
mean,
And bear in mind, also, it's not like there's any punishment, you know,
What?
there's
Right.
no.
but I think, I hear
I-
Peter's point.
Well, I will say on the third, thank you, Brian, but on the third page, I am asked to sign something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Which is-
which
which-
it just says you're
Interesting.
Which
doing
has a lot of
everything
stuff.
in your power to be productive, and it doesn't say, and if I don't,
I understand, but I just worry that if someone were to use this against, and I hear you. So also, on number 3, the board will consider research, best practice, public input, and financial impacts in their decision-making, and I worry, is this like an exclusive list? For example, Becky is an expert in HR, right? She has a lot of experience in human resource issues. Now, that's not listed here, like personal experience
Well-
isn't listed. And
Or interests of the students are not listed.
right, and so there's a lot of things not listed, and I know we can't list everything.
Right.
So it kind of concerns me to cut it off at these top 5. And again, I know what everyone's getting at. We're trying to have some basis. We can't just say, well, today I feel like we should move left, and tomorrow we go right. Like, that's not, I
Well,
don't,
in
just
several
better
of
wording.
the other policies, we put in parens, not limited to.
Well, the
Okay.
best practice would incorporate
A lot.
someone's individual
yes.
experience.
Okay, that wasn't clear, so thank you.
Well-
That's very appreciative.
And
Appreciate that.
students'
Mhm.
educational interest or
Okay.
whatever.
So I only have one more, but I'd like to note that I really don't comment on that many policies, so I feel like I'm getting a lot on this one.
I think this is a super
This is
interesting
great.
policy.
I do
right?
too, and so I just don't, I'm not gonna go on like this for the next 5 policies.
You could.
Well, I don't want to. The
Please tell me
appendix
we don't
that
have
in
65
theory we're
policies.
supposed to sign, maybe the mayors,
Yeah, what does that even mean?
I know what people are
That
getting
is-
at, like, people feel like it's, for the amount of money, like, let's say we wanted to spend 30 grand a student, but all of our kids went to Ivy League, that's a great return. Like,
Okay.
as a hyper, like, but
But not
that
on
is not
taxpayers'
what we
base.
wanna judge anything by.
Can I like back up?
I'm not
the
sure I agree with
conversation?
that one.
Okay.
I'm not sure, I'm not sure about having that language in either, so I totally hear what you're saying, but this, again, this is the verbatim thing, right, from the
The
essential worker-
declaration,
The declaration,
yes.
yeah. Do folks generally want to go down this road? I mean, to me, the first question
Right.
is,
Do we
we never
wanna-
did this in MPS, I don't know if you did this in Roxbury.
We,
Oh, good, I
Do-
was trying to think,
was-
did I ever sign something
Yeah.
that said
No.
something? No.
I don't know. if-
No,
It was when I joined the board, it was signed. I have no idea if the past board members, Kate came on after me. I don't know if it was brought forward again after that. I'm not sure how far it continued or when it kind of came into
On the
creation.
Roxbury board?
On the Roxbury
Oh,
board.
I was gonna say, somebody asked you to sign this when you
Right.
joined this
So
board?
like I said, there's never been a day when somebody came up to the meeting and said, hey, Ryan, do you remember? Here's your declaration of commitment. That this has been buried somewhere in a file for a long time, but
I can see the pros and cons, and I think if we go down that road, Peter, we have to have a pretty robust discussion about what's in it.
Right.
But I
What
guess
the
I kind of
First
want to
question
start
is,
at,
do
do
we need it?
people think we should do this, then we should agree on some principles that we have members sign.
What's the
Before we-
enforceability of it, and why are we signing it?
right.
Yeah.
I
That was
don't
my
think it's
question.
enforceable at all. Does anyone think?
I don't
it's
think it is
enforceable?
either.
No, you can't get kicked
And,
off the
and what if
board.
someone's elected and says, I don't think I wanna sign it?
Right, how do you?
Yeah, that's my question.
Don't think we can do anything about that either.
Right. And how does a board member get, I mean, what's the sanction? Is there, can a board member be sanctioned in some way?
Impeached.
Can they be removed from the board
I
if they're
think the
really
only
terrible?
thing that comes with further process is a conflict of interest,
Yeah,
which is in the
Which is a
conflict of
full-
interest policy, and that is part of what's in here. You're signing off to agree.
I mean, what if Becky punches you?
Yeah,
What?
there should be
She's
some
sitting right
consequence.
next to you, what if she just
Mhm.
gets so mad that she punches you? Like,
Come on.
I mean, obviously there are civil,
There is no,
recourse
we
for
do not
that.
have the ability to remove people from the board.
But that's what I'm asking.
We don't.
There's no mechanism for any
Right.
kind of consequence,
I don't,
so,
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I mean, we're just outlining what we would all
Recall.
like, but.
Well,
Oliver Vermont.
Why should we have the right to remove someone from the board?
Well,
You're
it's the
not
same, you know.
No,
think about we're
I'm not
elected.
saying that, I'm not suggesting we should have that right, I'm asking whether there is a mechanism to do it.
We're not debating whether to insert it into this
No,
document.
no, I mean, well, like the legislature does.
Right.
You can get rid of one of your members.
can.
You can get rid of one?
I was just gonna
We always
say,
lived in fear
You
of
can be
that,
expelled
actually.
from the legislature.
recently, there's
See
been.
McAllister common norm.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
true.
Right,
Uh,
right.
Yeah,
So we
So-
could have one, but we don't. I mean,
I'm not sure that we could, actually.
Okay, maybe.
I know, I'm not sure that the statutes would allow.
Okay.
us to do that.
So-
Question,
Right?
That's in the
Maybe
Constitution.
that's-
I don't feel the need to sign anything. I think when you join the board, you read through all these policies, and at some level, you agree to this member code of conduct, and that's your guiding light. And if you can't,
Yeah,
Maybe
right.
people have to sign this when they turn in their petition. And if they're not willing to sign it, they can't.
We
the city
can't
clerk
impose that
cannot
rule,
Yeah, I was gonna
just to
say.
be clear.
And,
It's gonna scare everybody away.
Actually,
and all of that, I suggest that we dump Appendix A.
yeah.
Right.
Second,
And the content,
Becky has a comment.
I have a comment. There is a reason to, if there's an unavoidable conflict of interest, say if your husband is an architect bidding on a project here, you need to be able to publicly, in some form or manner, be able to say so and
Declare
recuse
that.
yourself from the decision-making. Do we have a process for that?
Isn't that in here, in the
Is that in
conflict
here?
of interest?
It's
But,
conflict
but I
of
think we
interest.
should sign to it. I think
The
it should be
conflict of interest.
identified in some way and signed to it.
It just
So
says
you're
that you
saying
declare
there
it
should
and
be a
it's put in the
signing
minutes.
thing for conflict of interest, but not necessarily code
But
of
not code of
conduct.
conduct, but for
board can't-
conflict of interest.
How
if
does
we-
the
you saying
board
that we-
enforce that? Does the
Hold on,
board?
can I just understand Becky's question? Are you saying that you think members should sign the conflict of interest policy? Or
The
that
conflict of interest should be
Or that
the
they should-
public.
but that they should sign the policy, or that when they have a conflict, they should sign something?
And maybe this is weird to healthcare, but any place I've worked in the last 30 years, I've had to sign a conflict of interest document that in the last decade or so, I've had to reveal my husband was an attorney who occasionally took cases where
Oh, you
the-
mean sign something disclosing what your
Disclosing a
conflicts
conflict
are,
of
specific
interest.
conflicts.
But also that you would disclose? Did you sign
Yes,
that?
and that you make a
Upon hire?
commitment to disclose.
Yeah, I had to sign one at my new job.
And so I think if we restructure this declaration or make it a conflict of interest declaration, that would be sufficient. But if I was a member of the public, I would want to know if a member of the boards had a financial interest in the outcome of a decision of the board.
So it's
Well,
all
this-
true, the question is enforceability. So if the board has the authority to enforce something, then when you are elected onto the board, we have a whole packet of policies.
Yeah, we do.
That you can ignore
And you
every
raise your
single one
hand
of those
and-
policies because you've been elected, but the board will simply enforce it themselves. The question is, what is unenforceable by the board versus enforceable? And that's my concern. So the board can't enforce that you will not play to the audience during a debate. I mean, they could try, I guess. They
They could
can they
complain.
enforce conflicts of interest? How does the board enforce, if they we see this a lot where a elected member will not disclose a conflict. Everyone knows they have a
That's right.
conflict, they don't do it. Everyone's like, yeah, but they have a conflict and they're still voting.
Yes.
And how do we as a
That's
board
an
have
We
a,
have a policy.
we have a mechanism for kicking
For
that person out of the
having-
vote?
Well, we have a mechanism for having a hearing to decide.
There you go.
Whether there is a
Okay,
conflict
so
of
that's
interest.
good.
And if we find
Yeah.
that there is, then we would say that we find.
Yeah.
Find
Well, if
that
we
there's a
do that,
conflict of
then I
interest
think
and they
that's
shouldn't
fine.
vote.
And that's statutorily enforceable.
I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, I think that's in here. even if I didn't sign it, by the fact that it's policy,
Yeah.
it says that if there's a
Okay.
conflict of interest, I should be disclosing it.
Also,
Right.
some of the language that is in the Declaration of Commitment is maybe better than some of the language that's on the previous page of the Code of Conduct. And for folks on the policy committee, I would just say before we jettison Appendix A because of the offensive signature line, we should review it because some of
Yeah.
these things might
Oh, okay.
be
Absolutely.
well worded.
So just rework it. No, there's definitely overlap between the two.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
That's what we thought it was a little bit unclear, keeping them separate documents or keeping it in an appendix, so. Yeah, if we wanna scrap, and I guess is that the consensus of the board, the direction of the board on this is, we'll scrap the declaration, use some of the better language, and then come up with just a general code of conduct,
I think that'd be helpful.
and do?
I do think, we haven't talked about them too much, and I just wanna say that I think both B1, standards for how we engage at meetings, and I'm gonna say C,
Yeah.
commitment to the work of the school board.
Yeah.
You know, that these things are important, that,
Yeah.
that they should be in the policy, that we should be.
Yeah.
We might not be able to enforce them, but we should be monitoring and
Yeah.
working on improving, for example, the degree to which we have equal participation in a meeting and avoiding people dominating a discussion and avoiding playing to the audience. And that we should be openly, I think, and candidly discussing what it means to be committed to the work of the board, what it means to be a participant in committee work and to come to meetings and to do work outside of meetings. Because that's kind of where the rubber hits the road. So,
Bridget, can
yeah.
I monopolize the meeting further?
Yes, you
With
may.
the chair's permission. I'm gonna go back a step because I actually think it might be useful to sign it, not with this, I would take out the sentence about agreeing to abide by it, but to sign it indicating that you've read it and that it might be worth, for each new member who comes on, the chair should pull this out of the binder and be like,
Yeah.
I really want you to read this and show that you've read it.
But I might say that's part of procedure. We discussed a long time ago what we do for new board members.
Yep.
Who knows what we do? So that might be part of the procedure for new members, is to say for every new board member, we're gonna for sure take out these 3 policies, whatever they might be, and say, we'd like you for sure to read these.
These are our expectations. Read it, sign it, return it to the superintendent, so that we know that so that when I later say, Tina, you've gotta stop doing X, and you say, well, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that.
Yeah.
Right.
No, it's a good idea, I had some more thought in the discussion too.
Just my last one is the first bullet, just seems a little hokey. Recognize that a board member's responsibility is to see that schools are well-run, but not to run them.
That's like the VSBA's motto.
Yeah, that's the SBA right there.
Okay, they're the VSBA, we're not, like, I don't know, that's just
Point,
not,
no,
is
I
not
hear ya.
really something I'm really willing to
Yeah.
commit to. We've talked about all this other stuff, but that's just, it's weak.
There's, in the appendix A, the first thing about, and this is the thing Peter objected to, which I don't think I object to, but I want to be clear. Basically, this goes back again to things we learned at VSBA about, there's really 2 things we do. One is we take care of the students, and the other is we take care of the taxpayer, basically, or the owner. And the idea here is that we're gonna always do what's in the best interest of the students, but always balance it with getting a really good return on the dollar we spend. So, that's not really codified anywhere in terms of the actual mission of a school board member, I don't think. I don't think that says that in state statute about why we're being elected. And if that really is our mission statement for each of us individually, our role, I don't know. But that's what this is effectively saying, and that's what we hear over and over again, and I think that's what this is attempting to say here is, don't forget that this is your role as a board member, is to do this thing, which is look out for students and look out for taxpayers. So that's it, that's all, I just don't know how to word it any better.
all I'm saying is it's the term return on investment that bothers me. I don't,
It's a finance term.
it is,
Right.
ROI is,
Yeah.
it's not the right wording. I mean, yes, I believe we should be counting paper clips. I do. Like, I wanna know where every dollar is spent, and we are accountable for that. But to think of like these kids as a return on investment, so like,
Do we measure them when they're 24 and be
Yeah,
like,
Exactly.
so did I get my
So
money's
it's more
worth
like
there?
right,
stewardship
no, but
rather
really, like,
than-
you may have a class of kids who are just not that great, not that many go to college, but all of them go to VOTEC or become, and like, that's a great return on investment. Which taxpayers think that's good, which don't, like, who are we talking about? Like, it's just a
How do
weird
you
term
measure?
for me to use, like,
It's a strange
to
phrase.
commit to. But yes, we should be conscious in all of our decisions, how we're spending taxpayers' money. We need to do that. But ROI is not the term that I'm comfortable with. So, but I agree with Steve, right? Those are the people we are serving, not just students, right? We're serving all taxpayers. Actually, I would even argue we're not even serving all taxpayers. We're serving all residents of Montpelier. There are people in
Right.
Montpelier who don't pay taxes, but still
True.
are part of our
Yeah,
community.
sure.
That's very true.
Was that whole discussion at all helpful to the policy committee?
I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah.
I feel like
Okay.
we
I said, we
definitely.
can expect a good, long conversation on this one.
Okay.
I mean, it's about what we're doing. I would also just add that folks should feel free to, follow up after the meeting and at any time, edits or anything like that.
I've used up all my words for the evening.
No.
Don't say that.
You don't have
Something
any
might
edits on
come
the
up.
budget execution policy? Okay, so we also had on for second reading substitute teachers, fiscal management, budget execution, volunteers, and work study students. Those were really only on for second reading and not adoption because of the glitch around public posting tonight yet.
So I have a comment about the substitute teachers.
All right.
And that is, it says nowhere in here that you have to have a background check. And you did say that for volunteers, and I think you should say that for substitute teachers. Isn't
it
that
covered
the
in
law?
I'm sorry, I thought it was covered in another policy.
Well,
There's no, I mean,
it does say so in volunteers. It says you have to, I forget how
anybody
it
who's
says
in a
it.
teaching position has to have a
Employee.
back, I mean, there's anyone who has unfettered access to children at any time can only do so with a background check.
Under which policy?
Right, but I'm saying we
Under
don't
state
state
law.
it under state law.
It's state law.
Yeah.
We don't have to, because if you're a substitute teacher, it is state law that if I put you in front of a classroom, you have a background check. And the only reason it says specifically for volunteers is because you are not a teacher. And so I have to
You're
do
not
that for you.
hired.
I'm not hiring you. And so I'm not paying you, but if I'm gonna give you unfettered access to children, you do have to have a background check. If I have a volunteer who's in the presence of an appropriately background checked educator or member of the NPS, who's an NPS employee, I don't need a background
Right.
check for that individual. So it's state law, which is why it's not stated for substitute teachers.
Okay, as long as we do it.
Oh, dude, that is, if you recall, and I'm sure you do,
It is the law.
last year's Act 166 debacle was certainly around the fact that I was one of, and my colleague Lori Goslins, who's in the room, was another, who said, I'm not, I don't care that I'm holding up your money, I don't care that I'm, and I did, but the principle was, I don't care that you're not getting your money, this person right here, I don't know that he has a background check, and I'm not gonna release public dollars for a public school student to go into a private pre-K if I don't know that every single person in that private pre-K has been appropriately background checked.
And not only it relates that, it was the same kind of thing, like all of a sudden, because when this became law, background checks did not go through with any regularity. And that, I remember that first year of backup of background checks, and you had all these teachers already hired and nobody had a background check.
So yes, that is done and done.
Quick question, process question. When we hire teachers, of course, we do the background checks. Are they rechecked periodically?
So, we don't know.
No.
It's, what lawyer you saying?
We do not, as the employer,
Right.
recheck, do background checks, but teachers are required to do that when they're
Relicensing,
When they renew-
yes,
when they
yes,
renew
yes,
their
yes, thank
license.
you.
Okay,
So
that's
they
good,
have
that's
to every
fine.
time. Thank you for
Okay,
reminding me of
great.
that. I knew there
Good.
was something in there.
Thanks.
Good question.
Anything else on those 4 policies?
So can I be clear that since, and for those who are following along on TV, if you go to our website, mpsvt.org, and go under Montpelier Board of School Commissioners, and go to MRSD Policies, there is a webpage called Policies in Process, and all of the policies that we are working on are there in their entirety, and can be reviewed and commented on by the public. And if anyone is having trouble accessing them for any reason, they should certainly feel welcome to contact me in the office at 223-9796 or Brian at npsvt.org, and I'll be happy to get you a copy of any policy, electronically, hard copy, or otherwise.
All right.
That's
great.
my
So is,
warrant
these
for
be
adopt, yeah,
warned for
thank you.
adoption in
5-2.
5-2?
Good.
Everyone okay with that? Looks like everyone's okay with that.
So that'll be
You're saying
substitute teachers,
substitute.
fiscal management, budget execution, volunteers, and work study students.
Yep. Good.
Okay. On the class size policy, the last policy, the will got changed to shall. Did we change back to will?
Sure. Did we do that wrong? I thought that was in my notes.
It was in the notes to change shall to will on the volunteer policy, which you did.
Sorry, I thought that was across the board. Sure.
Well, no, it's across the board, changing shalls to will,
Okay,
not wills to shall.
got it.
So could I ask for clarification for this, because I tried to figure that out from the notes, but couldn't,
Oh,
so.
you weren't at the meeting.
I wasn't at
Yes,
the meeting.
okay.
So I'm just curious for a brief explanation of the multi-grade K-4 elementary. I remember why it was a Roxbury thought about that, so where are we now on that?
That it's by classroom, but I'll let.
Right, so Lori and I spent a lot of time on this and tried to run as many numbers to reasonably account for how best to support the diverse numbers that we could potentially see in Roxbury, including a class, including a grade cohort that could have as few as 0.
Yeah,
And as many as, say, what were we thinking, Lori, like 10 or 12, right? And so we decided instead of doing it by grade, we would do it by classroom. And with the caveat that no teacher will have more than 2 consecutive grade levels per classroom. So this top portion here is simply for, the one right here is simply for
Oh,
the
okay.
Roxbury Village School. So in the K-4
Okay.
school, the minimum average number of students per classroom would be 8. Optimum, we're saying, is 10 to 12, and in order to account for every mathematical possibility, we're doing less than or equal to 40, which we feel would
Right.
satisfy
Okay.
any permutation. And the way that we will do this to satisfy both reasonability and educational outcomes is that no teacher will have more than 2 consecutive grade levels per classroom. So for example, you could not
1, 2,
have
3.
1, 2, and 3.
Okay. And that was really put in to replace this there, right?
Yes, it is, because
Okay.
we didn't we felt that in order to support the most, a good policy with a lot of viability for a smaller school, rather than doing it by grade, because Lori and I just could never get around how to do it by grade with the numbers as we were projecting them. Like it just simply wouldn't work. And I think it was Lori who said, what if we just do it by like physical classroom?
Yeah.
And that'll actually make all of these numbers work. So that was the rationale behind making that change.
On the back page, 3rd paragraph, I would like you to consider a phrase at the beginning of the last sentence that starts, "the principal has." See where I am?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, would you consider the following phrase. After considering online platforms and dual enrollment options, the principal has the discretion to approve these course offerings.
That's a pretty big change there, after considering online.
And now, so here are my 2 points,
Okay.
and I did talk to Mike about this, that all you're saying is considering.
Yeah.
After considering online platforms and dual enrollment options. In other words, I'm just saying, actually, I will say that we are doing great at this. The percentages are up. I think we are doing this now. And so I actually did stop in to talk to Mike about this because I didn't want to say anything that indicated I didn't think he was doing a great job. I think he is. I just think that it's, the reason I thought about it was we haven't always done a good job at this. And I thought maybe writing it down would help us.
Others?
So now.
Thoughts on it?
You know, I mean, I don't mind considering anything, I just don't know what are all the things we should be considering. You know, this is a narrow list based on, I think, a value or a priority of, that we should be doing more of this. I'm not opposed to doing more of that, but I'm concerned that, are we just singling these things out, and I haven't had a second to think about what other things should we be considering, so that we're not making a special point on maybe 1 or 2 things out of 5 or 7 we should be considering. I don't know, but I do think this is a value statement that we throw in to a document that's, maybe has a few value statements in it, but, you know, but I'm just saying that, I think the idea is to give it some numbers here, and I don't know, I mean, I'm not opposed to it, but I'm opposed to it until I have a chance to think about what other things we would want to consider too.
I'm also not opposed to doing a broader after consideration of, meaning
Yeah.
consider something before doing this.
So, one concern I have in terms of the timing, I mean, we don't have to adopt it the next time, but is, this is the 3rd reading, and before we, you know, there was a process of getting input from all the principals on the language that we brought to the 1st reading, and I'm reluctant to change it and adopt it without having a chance to go back to the principal involved and get some input on the changes, because, you know, that was part of the development of the policy, and that's the person I think who would have the most input from the leadership team side. So I think if we were gonna make a change like that, I would wanna at least do that step first. What do others?
I think that's appropriate.
So are we directing the principal to do something
If
with
we
that
add
statement?
other,
Yeah.
yeah, if we had this other language, we are, I
Right.
think.
And that's kind of stepping outside of our realm in terms of how we're supposed to be
Policy
interacting with
government.
staff. I mean, granted, it's in policy, but still, I mean, I guess you could say our policies limit other staff members also besides just a superintendent, but it feels a little bit more heavy-handed in terms of telling somebody else besides the superintendent what to do or how to do it.
Would it be helpful to have something broader to the extent that the language could be proposed to Mike after considering other alternatives? I mean, I get the spirit where you're trying to go with
I'm
this.
okay with, yeah.
You know, and so that it's not, because this also goes to kind of Steve's point before about, I guess, and Michelle's too, about the reasonability of the interpretation of the policy. So if you're looking to be less heavy-handed, perhaps, you know, Mike might consider whatever I just said, after thoughtful consideration of alternatives.
Mhm.
So therefore, it's not just a, hey, I've got discretion to go below the minimum. The bar is that, you know, and however it's reasonably construed, I considered these alternatives. And for this reason, and this reason, it didn't necessarily fit in the mission or values or how about that. Because then it kind of gets to what you're thinking about, but it also doesn't say, you have to think of these 2 things as well. Would that be?
Yeah.
That said, your timeline is a reasonable question too, so I'm just trying to split the difference here.
And Ryan, usually in policy, we don't even refer to the principal.
Right.
Because we refer to the superintendent.
Right.
That is true.
We could just delete that whole sentence.
I think if we deleted the sentence, that would really change the meaning of the policy.
Okay.
I mean, it's trying to, we're trying to specifically
Yeah, I
say
see what
you
you're
can
saying.
bring the minimum average below by.
Well, I thought the sentence before that said that, but
I'm not sure the second sentence is clear enough
okay,
to say it's okay if the minimum average drops below
okay.
in that content area. Any other comments on this? So we can
4:30?
get a reaction about that proposed language. I have two proposals there, after considering online platforms and dual enrollment, or after considering other alternatives. I mean, I prefer the more general language, I think, but I'll get some reaction and put this one back on for next
4:30?
week.
Mhm.
Can we do
Yeah.
it next week?
We, yes, because it's not being adopted, sure.
It's not being adopted,
That's,
so-
absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Great. Ryan, out of procedural, do you want to try to get the in-district elementary school transfer policy on for the 11th, or do you want to wait till the 2nd? And I'm okay either way.
I think I could probably come up with a draft. Bridget, Steve, do you guys think you'll have a chance to
Yeah.
go through some iterations in the next week? Yeah. So you'll need it by
Friday.
Friday?
Which is 2 days from now.
Oh,
You want to shoot? Why don't we shoot for the 2nd? Let's keep it
Probably
reasonable.
more
I forgot
reasonable.
about
Let's
Friday.
keep it
Yeah.
reasonable.
I was thinking Wednesday.
Yep. Third reading will be on 5/2. Okay,
All right.
that's helpful. And you'll just give me feedback on how you want to put the language in, or you mean even just email to Mike, I think that's fine.
All right.
Okay.
So, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Anyone have anything they want to raise before we adjourn?
Thank you for all your hard work.
Yeah, it's
Agreed.
all
Well,
right.
Thank
we
you to the
appreciate it.
policy
Bridget,
committee.
thank you for running
Agreed.
such a tidy meeting.
Time.
1 minute.
All right, a motion to adjourn?
I move we adjourn.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Good night, everybody.
We're done.